We've had
Can you hear me?
multiple guests.
Yeah.
Oh shit, you're loud. Let me cut you down a little bit. All right.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, you're good. Audio leveling with new people and new mics is always a thing. I'm not gonna lie. When I get hit up by random people on the internet that don't send me links to like a channel or anything, I mostly expect like massively overweight, unkempt individuals like in a dirty room. I don't expect like a 40-year-old Anderson Cooper, beautiful fucking silver-eyed man next to his workout equipment with bisexual lighting in the background. All right.
Okay, we're off to a good start. I like it. I got nothing, dude. I got nothing.
Yeah, just
I'm sorry,
don't make it weird. Just take the compliment.
Thank you.
You look good, dude.
Oh, thank you. You're too kind. I meant to.
That was an invitation for you to tell me that I look good, but you know, I see how it is. Fuck you.
Always. Scott.
Yeah. No, it's okay.
I don't want to repeat myself.
It's okay.
You know. But yeah, I'm sorry. I meant to share my video with you, but yeah, it was. I'm sorry. Let me just get going here.
So you do make content?
Yeah. I have a YouTube channel, thepeer.review, that you can go to.
You know what? I could have just clicked that shit, you know?
No.
You know, there you go. There you go. Yeah, there you go. Okay. Well, you know, that shows you how much due diligence I do on my research when someone says they want to talk to me.
That's true. Well, I appreciate you, man, because it's been hard to try to talk to people about this, so I appreciate you giving me the chance.
Yeah, I mean, I figured.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Like, what is it you want to talk about? We're gonna.
Yeah, so I'm a scientist. I'm a PhD candidate in microbiology right now, and I basically do science outreach on YouTube. So my goal is to try to, talk to people and kind of just give people, the coolest things that I think that are happening in science, that are going on. And I think that science does a really bad job of actually connecting with the public. And
110%. I mean, have you spoken to Corey Campbell on Twitch?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so Corey Campbell, obviously smaller than me, but he's one of the few lefties on Twitch I will simp for, because I'm a hardcore libertarian anarchist, and fairly right wing in a lot of views. But he is a PhD candidate in also a PhD candidate in microbiology.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and he's like trying to do like the science communication sometimes. You guys might have an interesting, super nerdy conversation or something. And he's pretty open to dialogue and discussion. He does debates sometimes, but mostly he just sits back and is nice and makes a point here or there. And it's kind of funny watching a scientist try and get into blood sports, because, I love Corey and he's great people, but he's not good at blood sports. It's not his game.
Yeah, I'm more into, like an in-depth a conversation. I want to figure out, try how to better understand your views, and maybe you could ask some questions that you've always thought never got a good scientific answer on. And I mean, I know that there's a lot of blood sport debates out there, but in my opinion, hopefully I'm not going to put an edited video out there, but hopefully someone of your fans see my videos and they actually think it's a great conversation and they like it. And I debated Haas on the existence of DNA and genes and heredity, and I was actually really shocked on the amount of Haas fans that were in the comments and saying that it was a great conversation and they really enjoyed it. So
oh my god, in for Haas. I've never done a 1v1 with him. I was on a panel with him once before he got kicked off of Twitch, and it was kind of funny because the rest of the panelists were so wild and crazy and like midwit, uninformed, that like you had the tanky and the anarcho-capitalists like agreeing on basically everything, mostly because we were just willing to have an honest conversation at a level that was necessary, and the rest of the people were just like screaming bullet points. It was frustrating. But yeah, I'll definitely link you up with Corey Campbell, because I think you guys could have some awesome like nerdy conversations. In terms of me, in terms of science, anarcho-capitalism, I think, in like hardcore libertarianism, it has an interesting relationship with science. In terms of a political philosophy, right? Because the left is, as far as I can tell, is informed philosophically from consequentialism based off of their subjective values in terms of understanding harm reduction, right? And so when the science seems to support ideas that lead to their notion of harm reduction, they love it. And when the science doesn't support those things, they reject it. On the right, what it seems like you have is the right loves science so long as it doesn't interact or contradict their values, whatever their values are, right? And if the science says, for example, if there was a large study to come out tomorrow, right, that said that actually OnlyFans girls are happier and healthier than the average girl their age, right? No matter how many times I was peer reviewed, no matter how much science was backing that up, no matter different, studies, attacking it, trying to isolate for different variables, age groups, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, culture, whatever, the right would just deny it, right? They would just deny it because it clashes with one of their values. Okay. And what I think the biggest fault of science in general is that science has completely lost, well, at least its communication to the public has completely lost its enlightenment philosophy. Which I think is imperative to being able to understand science. So what we have now is we have a large group of the population that reads a title, reads an abstract, and thinks, this backs up what it is that I believe. How many citations does it have? If it has a large enough amount of citations, this is now what the science says. Right? They don't understand methodology. They don't understand empiricism. They don't understand that there's no idea of like inductive and deductive reasoning and how one attempts to approach the truth. Like you also have so many soft sciences like psychology, sociology, economics, and things that cannot be done in a laboratory environment and cannot isolate for variables. And yet they make the same level of scientific claims as, let's say, a chemist. And so it's just so muddied, I think, mostly by bad philosophy. I think libertarians have a good philosophy, but that we're a much, much smaller minority of people. And I think we're far more focused on rights violations, philosophically. And we could kind of give a rat's ass what the science says. If the science goes because if the science suggests in some way that it is that it would be better consequentially to violate rights in some capacity, we will just tell those scientists to go fuck off. And so I think that's kind of like, there seems to be a problem from every political sphere in being able to understand science. And the way that I see it is the philosophy is no longer there. And so it's just publishing of results in a system that's meant to be skeptical. It's insane. Like, how the hell do you communicate that?
Yeah, man, that's a good point. I mean, I try to surround myself in people that are kind of skeptical of science and stuff to try to better understand that. Like I exist in like online, like a lot of anti-vax communities and stuff where I try to answer like science questions and stuff like that. And that's one of the biggest things that I always say is like, scientists are skeptical inherently. Because especially when 99% of research science fails, you're going to be very skeptical actually even of the positive result. You're going to be like, what's going on here? This isn't right. There's no way. And there's a lot of failing. And I think that's actually the crazy thing. When you actually get a positive result, you're like, this is nuts. This can't be real. And then you reproduce it. You're like, what? Like, no way. This is crazy, And
right.
That's kind of where, that's where, the bigger ideas kind of build upon themselves, and how we've gotten to these, areas where, with COVID and, the lipid nanoparticles and stuff like that. I mean, I work in a nanotechnology lab, and that's old stuff, man. That's like 30 years old, actually. We're working with like single-walled carbon nanotubes. We're doing coatings for it with them. We're doing quantum dots, carbon dots, like really
Those
next
sound like
level stuff.
words. Those sound like words. That's what they
So
sound like to me.
carbon and quantum dots are things that are basically on the sides of like proteins. I mean, actually,
Mhm.
the single walled carbon nanotubes that I work with are actually the exact same size as like the tobacco mosaic virus. And that tobacco mosaic virus is just like RNA that's been, in a spiral, and we're doing complex things now that are really unbelievable in nanotechnology. Like, for example, David Liu's lab out of Broad Institute in Harvard, they're actually adorning things onto viruses now. I'm sorry, adorning things onto nanoparticles that make them look like viruses, so that they can go into specific cells and then deliver like molecular biology tools like CRISPR, and then
Mhm.
turning on and actually curing genetic blindness in mice. So they've actually done
Yeah.
this.
It's
Virus-like
fucking terrifying.
particles.
It's like
Isn't that
there's a
amazing?
small bit there's a small bit of like the Luddite in me that's just like,
Mhm.
can we not fuck with this? Like I recognize the utility and the amazing ingenuity of it.
Yeah.
But also the social, it's kind of like AI, where it's
Okay.
like, you hear things like that and you're like, cool, but like, is any non-scientist like wackos that aren't just excited for that positive result, like over their shoulder, like, hey, be careful with this. You know what I
Oh
mean?
yeah. I mean, it's a big thing
It's
right
pretty
now. Like,
regulated, I know.
honestly, for it's a big thing right now to talk about ethics at conferences. Like, so like, normally, like, 10 years ago, conferences, you'd have like the ethics be kind of like the last day, the last presentation, and nobody's kind
Mhm.
of going to it. Everyone's kind of like leaving beforehand. Now they're kind of like, in the day, they kind of have like presentation ethics kind of thing, and it's really popular ever since CRISPR was discovered and is used and is so widespread now. I mean, thousands of companies are using CRISPR, and in even more research labs. It's kind of like the standard tool of molecular biology to change DNA. So
Mhm.
there's a huge discussion on making sure that CRISPR is more specific, that there's no off-target effects. If there is any off-target effects, that we can usually easily detect them. Actually, David Liu, same guy. It's one of my favorite labs, I'll be honest. They're actually creating a new CRISPR that actually inactivates itself once it's done the cut, so that it can't actually continue to make off-target effects and stuff. So there's yeah, I just, more to your point, I think that they're like the basically there's what the public knows, and then there's kind of like the undergrad kind of like level, but then there's like research science, and it's like it just keeps growing, and the gap keeps growing, and there's huge ramifications in our society because of that. You can see it with COVID, misinformation about vaccines. You can see it,
I'm
there's
willing to bet we won't agree on a lot of the misinformation, but I'm sure we will on some.
okay.
I was pretty
Okay.
anti. I've been pretty anti COVID vaccine since
Okay.
it came out and still am.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I'm
Why is
also
that?
against the rotavirus, for the record. Fuck the rotavirus vaccine if you live in a first world country. Dr. Paul Offit can
Okay.
go suck my dick on that one. Like, you can give your
Okay.
kids saline.
Okay. Well, what's your views on the vaccine then?
My biggest fears in the vaccine, right? Luckily, it doesn't seem that it panned out with all of the different iterations, right? But, you know, we're given a vaccine, which, we can have a laughable debate about whether or not it's a vaccine as opposed to like a therapeutic, because of the viral load in the upper respiratory tract. In fact, it's not like a sterilizing vaccine. And that was kind of always my biggest concern, is the fact that it's not a sterilizing vaccine. Luckily we didn't have antibody dependent enhancement, but like, I think that was a legitimate, pretty big concern for me, was that you have a vaccine that reduces symptomology, but doesn't actually reduce the infection rate. And if you're not reducing the infection rate and people are asymptomatic walking around, and you only have one portion of the virus's structure, from the alpha variant, Obviously, we have like the new BA.5 vaccine that's coming out. I don't know. Is it out yet? I can't remember if it's
it's out.
Is it out like officially? Okay. Like I know like a week or two ago they were talking about it. But like obviously, you know, there is some catch up with that. But my biggest concern and my biggest reasoning there is, you know, we could get into, you know, the failures of the FDA throughout all of history. We could get into the fact that one of the labs was cooking their numbers when investigated by the FDA at Pfizer. But I mean, I think what Pfizer produced is relatively similar to what Moderna and J&J and the other mRNA therapies are. So like, I don't know that's the biggest deal. I think it shows the failure of the FDA, but not necessarily of the vaccine itself. But yeah, like I think if I'm not, and also I have an enlarged aortic valve, right? So like if I get fucking, myocarditis or pericarditis, like I'm fucking dead. Right. So obviously as someone under 35, like it's a contraindication for me to take it anyways. But yeah, like my biggest concern is that if you're not actually reducing the infection rate, right? And instead you're reducing symptomology and allowing people and restricting people and forcing on people, there's a lot of social and political things that are just immediately rights violations. But from the vaccine itself, that's kind of my primary concern, is that, you know, we don't know the long-term effects, but that's kind of true of any medication. So you hear people, well, we don't know the long-term effects. It's like, dog, that's every medication that comes out, right?
Yeah. If you want to see 30 years of data, you got to wait 30 years.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah, exactly. But, you know, if I was given a vaccine that, you know, was kind of proven to have a, I think this vaccine does have a statistically significant, is last time I checked, in terms of reducing the infection for the individual. But the problem is that if an individual is asymptomatic and they have the same kind of viral load in the upper respiratory tract, they're more likely to go out, not get tested, and spread the virus. So it doesn't seem to really reduce the spread of the virus. And yeah, I'm always concerned about ADE. Like I said, luckily, Delta came out, which was less deadly. Omicron came out, which is less deadly. BA.5 came out, which is less deadly, which is kind of the typical track of viruses, regardless of it, you know, interventions, right? And same thing happened with Spanish flu. That's a virus doesn't do well if it kills its host and, you know, isn't infectious, right? And so viruses tend to, you know, evolutionarily, but new variants come out and they tend towards the direction of being less deadly and more infectious.
In general, I mean, there is like the evolutionary push is to infect the next person. The virus doesn't care if it kills you afterwards. You know, that's doesn't care.
But if it kills you too quickly, or if it's too deadly, right?
And you don't infect anyone, then it's not going to be able to evolve. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, that's the evolutionary trap that it has, and that's why like RNA viruses and stuff, they'll have high mutation rates, but you know, to a point, right? If they mutate too quickly and too large, like you know, they can swap their genomes around inside of you and stuff like that, then they're not able to latch on to the the ACE2, which is what the SARS-CoV-2 latches onto.
The ACE2 receptors.
It needs to find another binding protein that it can bind to, or it dies. So I mean, so there, I guess there's like two different things that we're talking about, and this is kind of like the problem that I run into a lot, is like the oversimplification of science and stuff. And I try not to do that. I try to talk to people like they're adults, and so. But there's two different things that we're talking about: SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. So SARS-CoV-2 is the virus, and COVID-19 is the thing that the virus causes. And SARS-CoV-2 is going to spread to you, and it can be present, so you could be asymptomatic or pre-symptomatic, and it has to do with kind of like the curve, the growth.
It takes like 3 to 4 days, right? Yeah, it takes, I think, 3 to 4 days before you reach like the kind of the average peak of symptomology, and then you kind of get like a slower down.
But sometimes you don't get symptoms. You don't get COVID symptoms, right? You're not going to get. You could get symptoms of just like having like a virus in you, but then you might not develop some of the COVID symptoms, or it could be too early and you're going to develop COVID symptoms later.
That's true.
So it's hard, and there is. So I believe that that basically you have like there's different stages of your immune system. Honestly, I don't work with humans. Humans are actually really boring scientifically for me, but this is but I mean you have stages of your immune system, and basically you have kind of like the the basal, like the bacteria and viruses that are kind of like already living on you, that are going to be kind of like the first stage. And then you have your B cells and T cells that need to be activated in order to make antibodies and to all that kind of stuff. That's kind of like the second big wave. So it's kind of hard unless you have the antibodies are already in you and already going, then it's hard for it to stop the virus. Thankfully, a lot of these the vaccines, they do have kind of like a latent antibody that stays in your bloodstream for about 6 months. That's like the where it starts to really dive off. And there's conflicting evidence basically whether or not those antibodies in your body are going to decrease your viral load. I think that does. I think there's better evidence to say that it decreases the viral load within you. There's been a couple of papers that have said that they don't, but they use a type of molecular technique like qPCR, and they don't do the necessary work in order to figure out that. Basically, in order to know whether or not the amount of viral load that's in there, you have to do a serial dilution. So you have to dilute the amount that you have, and then you have to dilute it again, dilute it again. So, and then you basically correlate those numbers, and you get an R squared to see if that it actually dilutes. They didn't do that work.
Look,
they didn't do that
I'm
work
not,
to know.
I'm not a hardcore scientist, right? Like, I do my best as someone that is in the political sphere to talk about things that are politically relevant. So I do the best to educate myself in those regards. The issue is, I think the real issue in terms of the vaccine, right? As far as I can tell, is kind of what I've already stated, right? Is that it's obviously not a sterilizing vaccine. It just isn't, right? Like people are getting sick all the time with the vaccine, at a rate that is like not common with, let's say, a polio vaccine, or like, if you were inoculated against smallpox or something else, right? But the other issue is that there's three people working together here, right? And what you have is the super nerdy scientist types, right? The virologists and the researchers and manufacturers of the therapeutics, right? Then you have the epidemiologists, and then you have the state, the government, right? And there's a massive disconnect between these three people, because I think the people working on these therapeutics and things like that, while I think they're obviously biased in favor of their own therapeutics, they tend to be fairly honest, right? And when you look into the research, some of the things that they say, I think are, they've changed some of the wording in the papers that they use, right? Like efficacy, all of a sudden, had to do with symptomology, and then they kind of wouldn't state that. They'd kind of bury that somewhere in the results. So you had to like read the entire paper to recognize that they were measuring efficacy, not by like, infection rate or viral load or anything like that, but in terms of symptomology. Things that were obviously done to get other people to want to publish or want to, put forward their research, which is, just kind of the incentive structure. You want to write something good, and there's politics involved. And once politics are involved, some of the ethics, I think, start to go a little bit to the wayside. Not terribly from them, though, right? But in terms of the epidemiologists, there is so much junk science that was touted by governments and media organizations, such as like kids wearing masks in schools, right? Like these were things that were like not even real science at all, right? Like there was no, there was no comparisons, there was no control groups, there was no like, many of them were just like models. They weren't even like actual studies. Like it was horrible, right? And then you had the government that, took what should be, they felt, to be as charitable as I can, because I'm an anarchist, right? But to be as charitable as I can, they felt an impetus, the World Health Organization, the EU, different governments, they felt an impetus to do something and to get people to take the vaccine and to get people to comply with, government mandated like lockdowns or, all of the different things that they were doing to stop the spread of the virus. Right. And so what they did is they very clearly highlighted science articles that supported them. And they very clearly diminished, deplatformed, the American government used its own policymakers to put pressure on, Facebook and YouTube and Twitter from like Dr. Malone, people that are skeptical and people that you can say, I think they're wrong or I think their science is bad, but attempted to do everything they could to silence any dissent. And when you have that combination of like junk science from epidemiologists and from people that weren't even fucking like some random cancer researcher, and now NBC is touting it, and the panic and the government's ability to kind of pick and choose what it wanted to believe and then contradicting itself instead of just being honest and be like, hey, we don't know, this is what the science seems to suggest at the moment. All of those things together, of course you have massive skepticism. And we see today that there's still not appropriate studies on pregnant women, despite the fact that the CDC is still saying pregnant women should get the vaccine. We see a silencing of opinion of, let's say, the Moderna, right? Or was it Johnson & Johnson? I think it's Moderna, right? Men under the age of 30 that have much higher rates of pericarditis and pericarditis and myocarditis from the vaccine than from infection. You see this still to this day, you see the CDC comparing unlike variables and publishing that as like it's science, where like they're comparing all of the records of vaccinated people versus only the records of people that go to the hospital that are unvaccinated, right? You're seeing terrible science promulgated by the government in favor of corporations that have a monopoly from the state to get money. And then you're like, well, why is their vaccine, like, why are people not getting this vaccine? It's like, how could you'd have to be a fucking idiot, or you'd have to be a scientist that really knows their shit. Like, those are the only two people, right, that would be willing to just take the government's word at face value and trust this vaccine at this point.
Yeah, I think that the CDC does itself no favors when they use things like, preprints on a lot of their advisory stuff. I have a big problem with that. I mean, I think that the peer review process is probably the most important part of the process of, of science. No pun intended with my channel name, but it's like it's really where you kind of like open up your science and let it be seen and stuff like that. And there is, like, science isn't funded to the point where like people have tons of money to just do extraneous experiments. So you do have, like a lot of companies that go to labs, the top labs, and they're like, we need to have this studied. We're going to give you money to do this independent of it. And they do it, so that those science labs do that. And also government money, right? The government has an interest in what it is that they want researched. Yeah, they have the NIH funds it. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also, I think it's important to point out one of the biggest failures, I think, of science in general is it's a lot easier to get funding to try and prove something than it is to try and falsify something. It's difficult to get funding for research for peer review, more so than it was 20 or 30 years ago, because it's not interesting to the people. They want you to prove something. They want you to establish something. They don't want you to study something that's already been studied in an attempt to falsify it. It's just, it's harder to get those grants. And so I think the scientific process and the peer review process has been weakened over time because of the kind of the psychological incentive for like new research, as opposed to, making sure the research we have is good research.
Yeah, I mean, but the thing is if you falsify something, like, then what's happening? You have to study that mechanism, and that's what you're publishing. That if you can do that, you can't. It's just like you have to explain, like, okay, so if that's not happening, what's your hypothesis for why it is happening? And that's kind of like the positive step forward that happens.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's getting a little harder. I think the peer review process isn't quite as strong as it used to be.
I don't know if it's changed all that much. I mean, you have basically these journals being the gatekeepers, and it is kind of weird. There's only 3, peer reviewers that actually go through and I think that I mean, personally, I think it should be kind of opened up. I think it should be.
Mhm.
I like the idea of, I like the idea of preprints. I like the idea of you staking your claim to the evidence and then allowing public comment on that, and allowing kind of like more of a democratic process to be going through. These three people aren't the arbiters for their entire field, and they get things wrong. They actually try to sneak in their own papers. That's like, you always get a reviewer that's like, oh, you've completely missed this huge foundational step forward in this
Right.
in this field, and just
My
just
favorite
link
one
this
is
guy's Roberts et al. And you're like, oh, you're Roberts. That's why you say
yeah,
this.
yeah. My favorite one though is when you go to peer review and then they're like, oh, you missed this paper, you need to do better, and it's the author of the paper. And it's like,
Exactly,
you mean
yeah.
my own fucking research, dog? Like,
Yeah,
I love
yeah,
when that
exactly.
happens, when people like forget to cite themselves and then they're like, you didn't do this, it needs to be fixed. And it's like, dog, that's
Yeah.
me. Like, I'm not plagiarizing me. Like,
Yeah, the double blind thing, the double blind peer review is kind of weird. I think that the peer reviewers should be published as well. I mean, if you got to have more transparency than less in science, I'm pretty much always advocate for that. But I think, like, Malone, and it's an interesting case of someone that's unfortunately like grifting. Because of the pandemic, there's a lot of people that kind of were not associated with science, or they've been associated with the science far long ago. And his paper in 1989 on the GFP delivery for lipid nanoparticles was good. It was good work. And in 1989, it's still strong and during that era. But delivering GFP, which is a fluorescent protein, is going to be a lot different than an RNA vaccine. And there's a lot of work that had to be done between his delivery of GFP and what happened, the vaccine that we have now. There's a lot of flanking regions that had to be added. You have to stabilize the RNA through some molecular motifs, it's called. And so there's been a lot of development since that. And I feel like since Malone, since that time, he kind of got out of science. He was in that kind of consulting realm. He was in kind of like this weird space where his science wasn't really going forward. And then in my opinion, he's kind of capitalizing on this opportunity, because I mean, Malone is vaccinated. You know that, right? Like he admits that he is vaccinated. So
right.
I mean, by the way, I don't like the vaccine. Just to talk about your liberty claims real quick. I don't advocate for everyone to be vaccinated. It's a thing that you have to talk to your doctor about. I think that vaccines are safe and effective. Personally, I vaccinate myself. I get a booster every 6 months. My family does. We vaccinated our children.
Why would you vaccinate your kids, dude? Why would you do that?
Because long COVID has a lot of like interesting.
Not on fucking children.
But oh yeah, dude, we have no idea.
Dude, if you're under the age,
if brain damage.
No, if you're under the age of 24, you're more likely to die from a Tylenol overdose than you are from COVID. Like, long COVID symptoms in children are incredibly rare.
Well, I mean, it's actually a lot more prevalent than we're thinking now. A lot of the new studies that are showing that like long COVID symptoms are actually very prevalent. So in a developing brain like that, I'm not gonna test that. I'd rather have them.
Yeah, I'm not gonna test my kids on that. Yeah, fuck that, dude.
But it's
sorry,
it's
that like I have a legitimate like emotional reaction to that. Like that, like I'm a father as well, and like that, I just couldn't imagine doing something like that to my children.
I mean, it's the them being around their grandparents, them me not wanting to lose my parents out of COVID. It's us having it. I'm at the university with a lot of undergrads, so I'd rather like have them like be.
Wait, you said vaccinated. At a university with a lot of undergrads. How old are your kids?
No, me. Like I'm teaching. So
you just mean like you're worried about catching it? Yeah.
Yeah. It could be an asymptomatic carrier, a pre-symptomatic carrier.
Yeah, my kids had Delta and Omicron. They're strong.
Okay. Well,
yeah. Fuck that, dude. No,
I did just.
I'm not risking the fucking the unknown and obviously underreported vaccine injuries on my kids for something that is way like No, I just can't imagine that. That seems
Mm-hmm.
like if you're 40 years old, like I get it. Like, but oh man, sorry, that fucked me up, dude.
Do you get them vaccinated for other things?
Yeah.
Why?
What do you mean why? Because I told you the two vaccines that I don't support as of yet. The COVID vaccine and rotavirus, right? Because I don't think there's anything necessary to the rotavirus vaccination. I think the main reason that it's on the vaccine schedule is because Dr. Paul Offit sits on the fucking council and owns patents on the shit. And it's just not like it matters if you don't have access to clean drinking water, right? Like if you're in a third world country, rotavirus is a big issue. But if you get rotavirus, you get diarrhea, and if you get it really bad, you might have to give them saline.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't seem worth it.
So why do you think that the polio vaccine is so effective versus the COVID vaccine?
Like, you want me to explain deep science like at a molecular level that I don't understand? Like,
well, no, sorry,
I mean? Like,
I didn't mean to. I'm just like the sterilization. You were talking about sterilization before.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just like curious, like why do you think that those vaccines are so effective versus the COVID vaccine that you?
Well, I mean, like, obviously there's different levels depending upon the vaccine of like your likelihood of catching it regardless of being vaccinated, right? Like MMRV, for example, is really good and strong, right? Like you get an MMRV vaccine, you're not getting chickenpox for 20 years. Like, I mean, technically it's possible, but you're not getting it. Other, things like, a smallpox vaccine, which we're obviously not really doing unless you deploy or something. You know what I mean? Also really good, right? Like it's a live attenuated virus. Like it's not a big deal, right? As long as you take care of it and clean the wound, you know what I mean? Like you're pretty much not getting, because you're getting infected with smallpox, right? Like it's gonna fucking work, right? But yeah, like there are other vaccines that, aren't as good and depend upon herd immunity. Like I recognize that.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
But
it's because they're not in active pandemic, right? They're not mutating constantly,
right.
and
right. And also you don't have 70 fucking exposures when you go to the grocery store, like you might with COVID, right? But regardless of that, that's obviously a very different situation, right? In terms of that. So I do think whether or not you get vaccinated is depending on the virus also depends upon like what's occurring in your location in that specific time, right? Like if you were in Japan in the 1980s, right, getting an MMR vaccine was probably a really good idea, right? Because was it mumps that was going around? I don't remember which of the three was going around because of the whole like thimerosal situation. Japan was like no longer mandating that people get MMR vaccines, and then they had an outbreak that was like really bad, right? Like worse than like the Oregon moms type shit, but like really bad. So I mean, like I do think that like what's going on in the time and can change whether or not you want to get vaccinated for something. But like when we look at the polio vaccine and we look at, how many cases of documented vaccine injuries do we have? And then we compare that to the COVID vaccine. What we have is really good data on polio that says that it's really unlikely that you're going to have any reaction despite like maybe like being tired for a few days or something like that, right? And then what we have with the COVID vaccine is conflicting and massive amounts of conflicting data. Like we just don't fucking know. We have no idea what the pericarditis, myocarditis rates are. We have, we have no idea where these excess deaths are coming from, whether that's from COVID and they're not being counted by COVID, or whether or not those are vaccine injuries. We have politics that have involved that have been deeply infected into both the scientific community, but also in terms of the government. You know what I mean? Like we just don't know. And then also we have like if we look at like VAERS reporting, right? VAERS is reporting like something like 30,000, like really bad, reports as compared to like every other year. It's like 400 at most, right? But the issue with that is like how many of those are fraudulent? And then also, we also know that VAERS tends to underreport even in deaths. Right. And then we also have, tons of reports of people that are for political reasons not reporting. And then for other political reasons might be more likely to report, right? Because they're worried about the hospital getting sued or something. So they definitely want to make sure they report. And then in other places, they're like, what? No, that couldn't possibly be the vaccine when he died 2 days after getting the vaccine and he was a perfectly healthy 19-year-old, right? And so like, we just don't have good data, but it seems that we just don't have good data. Like my intuition is that it's much, much, much higher, but it could be just the same as any other vaccine, right? And so, yeah, I'm not going to take that risk for something, for children, that, especially because by the time the vaccine rolled out, I think my kids had already had COVID once, right? They got like Delta, like right when Delta came out. If I'm like, or like you couldn't get it for children, right? So they already had a level of natural immunity. So it would just be like even an extra level of absurdity to vaccinate them when they already have natural immunity and like they just released it. So like I want, especially before I give it to my own children, I want 10, 15 years of research, and I want completed clinical trials for all age categories, which we don't have. We have completed clinical trials for healthy people between the ages of like 25 and 45. That's what we have clinical trials on. And we don't even have good clinical trials because those people then got fucking vaccinated later. So like we can't even compare them long term. They poison their own clinical trials. We don't have any good clinical trials for any of these vaccines.
Yeah, it's kind of like an ethical thing where you can't really give someone a placebo when it's during an active pandemic and they think that they're vaccinated or they.
Yeah, I'm not saying I blame them, you know what I mean? But I do say that it poisons the well on having a good set of data. And they didn't like the original, the later ones are better, but the original ones that they did to get FDA emergency, authorization. They didn't even take a lot of blood work or like cholesterol levels, or like they did really shitty clinical trials.
Yeah,
unless that data hasn't come out yet, because they're coming out with data like, data dumps of like 100 and 150 pages at a time. And it doesn't appear that data is in existence. It might be there. And Pfizer, of course, is, no comment as always.
I mean, so it's interesting that you bring up the myocarditis and the pericarditis, because a lot that's actually from VAERS reports. So it's from people talking about that on VAERS, and that's how they studied it. That's how it initially was found.
UK. Yeah, well, that's how it was initially found. I thought you meant like all the data was from that. I was like, no, we have like actual research. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, it was that's where it spiked. So it's a good example actually of the VAERS system working in those, because you can't just take the amount of reports and the number of reports. You can download it yourself. There's a lot of and you look at studies that study that.
Yes, chat. Hold on, pause. Yes, chat. This is supposed to be about climate change, but we got into shit. All right, it happens. This is what happens when you talk to smart people. We can talk about the climate change here in a minute if you want.
Yeah. So our the data on the myocarditis and the pericarditis, you're right. With baseline, nothing, wild type human, taking a vaccine is going to be a little bit higher on the pericarditis. However, we have very good data to show that COVID-19, so getting SARS-CoV-2 and then establishing COVID-19 symptoms, if you get COVID-19, you have a much, much, much higher risk of myo and pericarditis than that.
Right.
And
but
also it's really interesting.
But now you're taking the entire population, number one, and number two, you're taking if you get symptomatic COVID, right? And so the issue with that is that's not really comparing like variables there, right? And it's also not talking about the demographic that I mentioned, which was men under the age of 35, right? For men under the age of 35, there's been several research papers that have shown that especially with Moderna, but with all of the vaccines, they're more likely to develop this than just catching COVID. But when you compare it to getting COVID and getting like long COVID, right? And you're talking about versus just people who are vaccinated, right? Even though we know that some vaccinated people also get long COVID, right? Like there's a lot of signifiers there to kind of justify the vaccine is like safe and effective, good and go ahead and get it. When I'm specifically talking about a specific population.
Okay.
Like if you're a 65-year-old woman, right?
Mm-hmm.
Even though I'm pretty anti-vax for this, and I think a lot of the research is muddied, and I think that there's a lot of government influences that I don't like in this, and money that I don't like in this, I'd still say if you're a 65-year-old woman, I'd still be like, dude, go get the fucking vaccine, right? But if you're a healthy person that's not overweight and is getting sun, and you're, middle-aged or younger, I'm not a medical doctor. Talk to your fucking doctor, right? But, like for me, if I was in that category, that's a very different conversation.
Yeah. I personally, I love getting vaccines. I feel like a superhero afterwards. It's like, it feels awesome. So, but it's interesting you bring up the polio vaccine as an example of like a really good, well-working vaccine. The attenuated.
We're gonna talk about the polio vaccine and all the horrors that came from that, or the Spanish flu vaccine, because there's been some hiccups. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, people got polio from the polio vaccine because it went from a shot to an oral thing, and people actually got polio from it. So, I mean, basically how that works is like a live attenuated vaccine has basically been bred into like mammalian models, and it basically it's infected and then taken out and infected in the other, and kind of like what you were talking about before, where if it mutates enough, it kind of like doesn't kill the host anymore, and then they take that mutated virus and then they give that to you. So the big benefit of this vaccine, of the RNA-based vaccine, is that it doesn't have all those mutations anymore in it. And we have the exact same spike protein that is in SARS-CoV-2, and we know that that's well conserved in biology and molecular biology. Well conserved sequence is one that doesn't readily mutate because it needs to bind onto your ACE2 like receptor in order to get in.
But that was always my concern going all the way back to ADE, right? Was just using the spike proteins, right? And like look at Omicron. It was the spike proteins that changed the most in Omicron from Delta and the Alpha variant. And that's always been my fear with ADE. It looks like my original fears were unfounded. Or maybe not unfounded, but luckily didn't occur, I'll say. But we could go back and forth about this. I've that's fun. But someone has a really good segue that I think is a great question to ask you, which is the guest in favor of the nuclear vaccine? It's saved 2 million people since 1970.
The nuclear vaccine? I don't know what you mean.
It's a joke about nuclear energy.
Nuclear energy? Yeah.
Yeah, because we're big simps for nuclear energy over here.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, so I guess, if you don't mind, maybe we can like kind of talk about the big issue about like, climate change, and then talk about like the solutions afterwards, which would be like, nuclear energy and technologies and stuff like that. So
yeah, sure.
I guess like the better like
this was the impetus to want to talk to me. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think that humans are having a negative impact on the environment. It's actually the reason why I am a scientist. And I think that the latest Inflation Reduction Act that had a bunch of climate change stuff in it, I'm a huge proponent of it. I think it did an awesome job. And
I would like Chad to just know for a quick second that this was a brilliant pivot by Greg to not answer the question in terms of whether or not he's a large proponent of nuclear energy. But we'll continue anyways.
So nuclear, I think that all technology should be researched. If you like nuclear, research nuclear. Like, I'm not gonna say
it's another pivot.
I'm not gonna say don't
not answering the question.
But the problem is there's there are some problems with nuclear, and you kind of have to go to all a lot of different types of renewables because it isn't renewable. Fundamentally, nuclear is not renewable, and my bigger point is that it only solves one problem, which is emissions. So it's not renewable, and it only targets emissions, and we're actually impacting the environment in a lot of different ways more than just emissions. So and there's
I think nuclear is just obviously known to be the safest form of energy, the cleanest form of energy, and the best form of energy. And I think the fear mongering around nuclear is abhorrent Malthusian bullshit pushed by states and corporations and environmental activists whose goals are in no way, shape, or form aligned with a healthier, happier planet. If you want a healthier, happier planet and people, you should just be supporting nuclear, full stop. Like, obviously, there are problems with any form of energy that need research and need solving. But I just think that if you're not seriously promulgating nuclear, like, I kind of just don't take that person's takes on climate change seriously, because like I just don't believe that person is legitimately informed. They're either ideologically captured in some way to not be honest about climate change, or something else is occurring, because I don't believe anybody that says that they don't support nuclear as the best option, and then offers like some forms of other, skepticism and things like that, because like it's just. Yeah, anyone that I know that I've ever met that's passionate, from anarcho-communists like Your Environment Seattle, all the way to hardcore right-wingers, once they dig into the science and the understanding of it, they go, wow, this is obviously the best option.
Yeah, it's an option for one thing, for emissions only, but we are impacting the environment in a lot of different ways, and I'm a proponent of nuclear in
what's our best option. Like, there's nothing comes without cost, right? And energy production by humans is going to have costs, right? Mm-hmm. Right. But can you name an option other than maybe like geothermal, which is, location specific, right? But can you, an option that could be adopted kind of like universally, so long as they have the technological scientific means to do it and they have the resources, in terms of money, right? Can you name an option better than nuclear?
So nuclear is a really good point and a good technology for places that are really basically small and very densely packed. So like, for example, like Japan, which is like
cities,
an island. So you don't have that much space. You don't have that much open space. So like it's a really good option for countries like that. Countries that are larger, that have open space, that have a land for solar arrays and wind. Those are a lot cheaper per kilowatt than nuclear, and they're renewable, which nuclear.
They're less renewable and more dangerous than nuclear.
I mean, nuclear isn't renewable.
Neither is solar or wind.
Of course it is. How would it not be? No,
because the wind itself is renewable, right? Sunlight is renewable, but the precious metals, the mining, the construction of these things, and the potential damage that specifically wind turbines do is, has detrimental impacts, but also has a carbon footprint. For example, solar panels that are designed to last like 30 years, they don't really become carbon neutral, right, until about 7 years after production, and they usually get replaced after 15 years, right? So obviously they're better than, let's say, burning coal, right? But in terms of calling it, renewable, and then saying, oh, well, thorium, right, and other, less researched nuclear technology, but even, regular enriched uranium, saying that these things are not renewable because there's a finite amount of that specific resource, even though we have enough thorium to power the planet probably for the next 40,000 years at least. And it's cheap if we can simply get the research done like China's doing. But to say that that's not renewable, but something that requires precious metals in order to produce is renewable, I think it's a misnomer, because the energy source is renewable, but the reality of producing the things that are required in order to produce the energy is not necessarily renewable. And of course, wind and solar comes with other problems that, nuclear doesn't have. Like you said, for wide open spaces, it might be a part of the solution for sure, right? But there's also problems with like energy load, right? The battery technology, which of course comes with all kinds of other environmental issues, right? To store solar is an issue, and brownouts and blackouts can be a real big deal if the energy grid is too dependent upon solar and wind. at nighttime when the wind's not blowing, right? You know what I mean? Like you have to store that energy somewhere else so that it can be used during those times. And if the energy grid dips too low, you end up with blackouts or brownouts. Like there's a lot of, it's a more complicated thing than just, oh, it's renewable because the sun exists. You know what I mean?
I mean, nuclear has a lot of the same problems though with batteries. I mean, a lot of that energy has to be stored places. It has to be, you're basically talking about electric vehicles, and that those electric vehicles have the same problems that you're talking about. And
but the difference is that there's not a differential in power production based upon the availability of wind or solar, right? So while yes, there's still battery technology and storing of energy and things like that, we're not in a position where like we can only farm sunlight, you know, at a maximum for 14 hours a day. Whereas with nuclear, a nuclear plant can run 24/7. It doesn't need to have different times where it's producing different outputs of energy. Now, granted, there is some environmental things that can happen with nuclear. For example, you know, a lot of it depends upon water, right? And if that water levels like decrease significantly, like that can reduce, like we're seeing this in France currently, right? Because they're having a pretty bad drought. And so some of their nuclear plants are reduced because they're dependent upon the Rhine. You know, so there are environmental concerns with nuclear in terms of like whether or not it can produce energy, but much, much less so than solar or wind.
Yeah, I mean, there's not going to be one solution, and I think that's the problem with a lot of like nuclear people that only talk about this. Like, and it's like it's kind of frustrating because again, we're talking about solutions of emissions, and of which nuclear is an option. And I'm not even saying that we should be 0% nuclear. There's going to have to be a lot of different options. A lot of hydro, like hydroelectric dams are a great example of hydroelectric's basically a big battery, because all a battery is a difference of electric potential. So that's a great store of energy. It is cheaper to make solar and wind turbines, and you don't have to deal with the waste too. So it's
first of all, it's not cheaper. It's not cheaper to produce solar and wind for the amount of power that you get.
That's not what the IPCC says.
Yeah, exactly. Right. And let me explain to you why. It takes 3 years of government regulators in America, right, for you to actually open a factory. It is hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars every year, right? Just to get inspections and get through the paperwork loopholes. It is one of the most regulated industries in America. And that is the reason why the costs are so high. It's not that nuclear is prohibitively expensive compared to wind and solar. It's that wind and solar get constant subsidies from the government. They are given free money so that their corporate friends that are in support of these things can produce it at a lower cost than the market demands. And nuclear is heavily regulated so that it's massively more expensive. And the fear mongering and the insurance costs are also extremely expensive. The fact of the matter so that's number one. It's not more expensive. It's just more expensive now because of the government standing in the way and causing it to be more expensive, and then stealing your tax dollars to specifically give money to wind and solar. The second thing that I would say is that in terms of dealing with the nuclear waste, I think I agree with what you're saying. Nuclear waste does have to be dealt with. But I think a real huge problem with having that conversation is the massive mythology of what nuclear waste disposal looks like, because people imagine barrels of green goo that are going to poison the environment, when really all of the world's nuclear waste could fit in a single football field today and could be properly contained, dug 100 feet deep, right? Like it is in Norway, for example, they literally have people go and look at nuclear waste as part of a museum exhibit because it's perfectly safe after you put a couple feet of concrete in between it, and you can go check out a museum exhibit. So when we say, oh, well, we have to deal with the nuclear waste, it's like, yeah, except we can use those rods every 20 years again for slightly less capacity, right? I think it's like something like 88%, and then there's like kind of a fall off, right? And so we're talking about thousands and thousands of years before, like, we're just storing waste that actually we can't reuse. And even still, there are tons of technologies that could be developed. There's nuclear plants now for small nuclear plants that are built completely underground. And then after, like, they go through like a round of production for like 20 years, they like are close off and collapse in on themselves, and then they're just done. Like, there's tons of solutions to this. And but when we say nuclear waste, we think of like this dangerous, horrible thing. It pales in comparison to the environmental damage done by solar and wind, done by the farming of precious metals, done by the slavery for the conflict metals that are used in that technology. The rape and the murders and the death of people and the poisoning of villages in Africa over and over again. Like, both from a human cost and a financial cost and an environmental cost, solar solar especially, it just fucking loses, dude. It's a solution for like maybe 5-10% of the grid, but it should never be our primary solution. Our primary solution right now should be nuclear.
I mean, so if you're saying that the regulatory agents, the regulatory part of wind and solar is the biggest problem with it, are you saying in your anarcho-capitalist utopia you have wind and solar power as the primary? Is that that's what it sounds like?
No, I said you said nuclear, not wind and solar, nuclear.
No, but I thought I was just thinking about, like, if the state wasn't involved and you don't have all these regulatory elements anymore, then you'd be more of a proponent of wind and solar.
No, I think the market is a more effective, better regulator than government is. I think that government is a monopoly on regulation that allows for regulatory capture, where certain industries with large amounts of capital are able to purchase politicians and lobby for certain types of things. And what often ends up happening is the most powerful and wealthy and the most well-connected have the capacity to make regulations for thee, but not for me. And I think that in a free society where our government doesn't have a monopoly on power and violence and regulation, that what will actually occur is healthier, better regulation on those industries. That's probably more strict and than our current things, but more pointed towards those that actually damage and harm humans, as opposed towards regulations that get in the way of large corporations pushing, damaging things like wind and solar.
Okay, interesting. I mean, when you're talking about like the damages of wind and solar, it seems like you're talking a lot about like the mining. You're talking about a lot of the rare earth mineral mining, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
The labor that's being stolen for that.
And the carbon as well. I'm also talking about the emissions, right?
Okay.
Because you don't get carbon neutral for like the first 7 years, right? So there's still an admission cost to all the mining and the precious metals and the construction. And then these things are usually, manufactured in China. So then there's shipping of all of those things and then shipping across the country. Like there's a lot of emissions. Now, some of those emissions obviously could be solved, right? Like if we had, if everything was fucking, let's imagine a world where everything is solar powered, right? Well, then mining of the solar powered stuff wouldn't cause as much carbon because the mining equipment would be solar powered, right? You know what I mean? Like, so more solar power kind of,
do you think,
means less carbon for the solar power. I'll bite that bullet for sure. But yeah.
I mean, with a lot of, the Inflation Reduction Act's like climate change bills, a big portion of that, I think it's like $100 billion is just about national production of those things. So we're no longer, building those things in China. We're no longer shipping them like you're talking about. I mean, is that something that you're in favor of?
Well, I'll never be in favor of spending billions of dollars for anything from the government. That's stolen money, right? Like that's it's a scarce resource that they took out of the economy to slow down technology, innovation, jobs, happiness, and health of humans, and then reinvested it in the places that they believe it should go. And it's always going to be less efficient than the market. And it's always going to fall, the road to serfdom kind of Hayekian issue, which is, in order to calculate price, they need to do research in a way that the market doesn't. And so that's wasted resources that is destroyed. And And so, yeah, I'll never be in favor of it. Even though if I had to choose, like, gun to my head, right? And it's like, I'm stealing $100 million. That's not a choice you get, right? Where this $100 million goes, is it going to be more research on the F-21, the new plane we're going to waste billions of dollars on and then just end up sending to Israel because it sucks, versus investing in energy? I guess, sure. I mean, like, if I have no choice, I would prefer that, right? But I'm never going to be in favor of a rights violation.
Okay. I mean, like, I guess to the bigger point then, like, I mean, you're talking about the destruction of the environment. You said earlier that you didn't think that you thought the humans were having a negative impact on the environment. I
think it's unquestionable that humans have a negative impact on the environment. I value human life more than I give a fuck about the environment. The environment could rot and fucking destroy itself if that process doesn't harm humans. I don't give a fuck. If we could kill all the bees and it didn't like fuck with pollination, like, why the fuck do I give a fuck that there are less bees, right? Because honey's more expensive? Well, now that's a problem. That affects humans. But I don't give a fuck about the bees. I don't give a fuck. I mean, I actually do donate to Apis M because I care about the bees, because that's why I'm bringing that up, because I think it is important to the environment. But what I'm concerned with is human happiness, flourishing, wealth, and the ability to innovate. But I think it's undeniable that humans negatively impact the environment in some ways. What do I believe the doom and gloom kind of scientists that say the Earth is ending in 10 years, every 10 years since the 1970s? No, of course I don't believe that shit, because they're wrong every 10 years and then they just never like admit that they were wrong. And then they're like, but this time Florida really will be underwater. It's like, you know what I mean? But like, there's obviously an effect. And it's probably not good for humans in some regard. It's probably something that needs to be tackled. But I don't think governments are the way to tackle that. I don't think stealing technological innovation is the way to do it. I think freeing the market and getting rid of those regulations is the way that we solve that.
Yeah, I guess I just see human health being tied to environmental health. So you can't really have the destruction of the entire environment and also have a human population that's healthy and thriving.
I agree. Yeah, I agree to that. Yeah, I just think the market would be better at solving that.
Okay. I mean, I've had, so full disclosure, I mean, I've had, labs that I've worked in, like, funded by the National Science Foundation, by the Department of Defense, and I had a personal fellowship from the Department of Defense. So, full transparency, just letting you know. But
it's fine.
Mean, a lot of those, large government entities, I mean, they're giving jobs, right? They're creating jobs by creating
government can't
positions.
Create jobs. It's impossible for the government to create jobs.
I mean, how else would I fund research that's not profitable?
Right. Well, okay. First of all, you probably wouldn't fund a lot of research that's not profitable, right? But for example, if we look at cancer research, right? A majority of cancer research in America, the funding comes from charitable donations. So, right? Because people really care about cancer. Now, in terms of other things, yeah, like certain things probably won't get funding. But when you say the government creates a job, what you're really saying, right, is that somewhere between 40 to 52%, it kind of depends on how you look at the numbers, right? Whether or not you count inflation, property, like what property values go up, so like that changes property taxes more than the actual like percentile of property taxes, etc., right? But what you're really saying is 40 to 52% of all of the wealth that was created in this country was taken, right? And then after we took possibly a very large minority or possibly a majority, right, of all of the funds out of the economy, we then created jobs with that money. But see, they didn't create that money, right? Like the only money that's created by the government, assuming we're not talking about like the Federal Reserve printing money for them, right? Which causes inflation, obviously. But the only wealth created by the government is like the U.S. Postal Service, which has been bankrupt a ton of times, right? Like they're not actually a business. So they're not actually creating jobs. What they're doing is they're taking money from you and then creating a program and then saying, look at the jobs we created. You see what I'm saying? So they're not really creating jobs the way that a business is creating jobs. You see what I'm saying? They're taking money from elsewhere out of the economy to then do something. So when you're like, oh, look how they created a job. It's like, yeah, with stolen money, like, you know what I mean? Like that would have gone elsewhere.
But there's money that goes to science that wouldn't have been going to science if it weren't for the government entity, because there just isn't, the bedrock of science innovation and research and hypothesis driven research is basically asking questions that, and seeing what's behind that curtain and just keep going, like there, how, like a good question is like, how does bacteria defend itself? That's not a question that could be, profited from, the research, that ties
true.
to that.
That's not true.
How would you like the molecular mechanisms of figuring out how like a bacteria defends itself isn't inherently profitable?
Okay, well, so a company does research. They do research all the time.
No.
Companies do this all the time.
No.
No,
you're misunderstanding.
You could look from. No, companies.
So trust me. I'll get to what you're talking about. The research, the scientific bedrock questions aren't profitable. And these, like, for example, to bring into the bacterial defense question, Jennifer Doudna is, for 20 years did research on how do bacteria defend itself.
Mm-hmm.
That wasn't a profitable research question until she discovered they defended themselves by a thing called CRISPR, and then CRISPR was then allowed to be used at, in biotechnology companies, and the biotechnology companies used that CRISPR, but they didn't actually research CRISPR to discover it. They used the foundational research question, the original one, and then copied it. I mean, I worked at a biotechnology company. This is exactly. It doesn't
matter whether or not it's profitable. The polio vaccine, right? Or not polio vaccine. Sorry. Fuck. Now I can't think. Penicillin, right? Penicillin was not only done purely for scientific pursuits, but it was also tested on himself, right? And did that illegally against the government's wishes. And at the same time that other scientists were trying to attack him was the same time that he was getting nominated for a Nobel Prize. And then he gave it out for free without like maintaining intellectual property rights, right? So this is a perfect example of a time where it's not profitable in any way, shape, or form, and someone still did that because that was what they valued. What I'm saying is that if you stopped stealing 40 to 52% of all of the wealth from the country, you'd see a lot more of that, especially once you curtailed all the government regulations that make it expensive or difficult to do these forms of research without the behest and approval of the state. Now, would it go down from a consequentialist analysis? Maybe. I don't know. But technology would also innovate in other places. And it's not this idea that like science and research is so isolated that we don't learn things from other disciplines, right? Is kind of an old world view of science that like we started attacking in the 90s, right? Is that we do need to be interdisciplinary. And I think, you can look at if that money wasn't taken, even if it wasn't a specific thing that wasn't profitable, there will be breakthroughs in things that are profitable that gain knowledge towards those things that make those things cheaper and easier to do. Like knowledge can be gained from domains that are profitable and then given either freely or sold or whatever, right? Towards things that are good for us. This idea that it can only be done by the government because the profit incentive isn't there is a view of capitalism that profit incentive is the only means by which businesses operate, or that by which individuals operate within a capitalist system. And that's just not true. Like charity exists. There's plenty of reasons that people invest in things that they wish to see, right? Like, so for example, the CEO of Merkel, right? Or the former CEO and CFO of Merkel, which is a giant insurance industry, multi-millionaire. I think he's like real close, but not quite there to being a billionaire, right? Well, his granddaughter had autism. And so because his granddaughter had autism, he set up the Faison Center, which is now the leading piece of autism research and early interventions in childhood development in the entirety of the United States of America, because this one rich guy had a granddaughter with autism and was like, yeah, I'm going to set up this center and we're going to do a ton of research there and we're going to help kids with autism. And so that's an example of how one person who has wealth values something and did something better than the government and John Hopkins University, at least in this very niche field, towards that research, simply because that was a passion project. If that guy, instead of having $800 million, didn't have all of his money stolen, we know that profit is exponential. So at the very minimum, it'd be a 1.6 billion, right? Or like 2 billion or 3 billion. If that guy had triple the fucking funds to invest in his pet project, we'd be in a much better world with better research on autism interventions for children. But unfortunately, we have a government that steals money and creates jobs.
I mean, it's just sad to think that we would have to sit there and wait for the angel investor in order to feel like that bacteria's immune system's worth investing into in order to research it. And probably would have
I'd
never
say the
had
exact
CRISPR.
opposite. I would say that it's sad that you think that people don't have the capacity to invest in those things, and you think that their money needs to be stolen so that the government can do these things because no individual would invest in that. And I think that that's just not true. I would say that you have a more pessimistic view of humans because you think they need to be stolen from in order for these things to be researched.
No, I mean, I'm definitely an optimist. I do think that there is a good nature in humans, and I agree with that. And like that's something that I actually really empathize with in the anarchist viewpoint of the world. It's just that there are lots of things that need to be researched that cost billions and billions of dollars. CERN, for example, is something that's like multi-nations. I mean, there's some things that can only be invested in at the national level or international level, and it just doesn't. We're talking about for example, right now, like in the United States, we're actually spending for the first time ever more money in science and engineering than we are in the defense budget. So I'm really happy about that. I'm really that's a huge thing.
Sure, that's good. I mean, I think they're spending too much money in general, but which would be $1. But yeah, I don't. So the CERN thing is interesting, right? Because what we're comparing is kind of an imagined scenario versus the one we're in, right? Which is what does a world look like where half of all the wealth isn't stolen from us? Versus one where half of all the wealth is stolen from us, but then those things are going towards projects that you kind of waste a lot of money on in the name of like the development of something like finding the fucking God particle, right? You know what I mean? Like finding Higgs boson is like crazy. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's insane. Like we haven't done much with it yet, but I'm sure insane things will come from that research at CERN. And like, would this world have created that? I think probably. Would it have done it slower? Would it have waited until the technology was in a better place? Maybe. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to compare the two. But like we do have other examples where people are like, oh, well, look at NASA, right? But there's a lot of mythology told about that, I think too. You know what I mean? Like IBM created an entirely new computer system for NASA, but that was the impetus of government funding. So it's like this weird corporate public partnership, also known as fascism sometimes, but we won't go there. Right. You know what I mean? So it's like, is it really a fully public thing? But also if the public thing was there, would IBM have done that in the first place? And the answer is maybe not as quickly. So it's really difficult to say, what I would say is that I have faith in humanity, that if our potential and freedom was unleashed and we weren't crippled under so much oppressive taxation, that we would see innovations, the likes of which like we can't even imagine. And I think if we had been living in a free society, it's not even impossible for me to imagine that we'd be living in a post-scarcity world at this point. Like, honestly, like at least in terms of like material resources. Obviously, brain power and your body is a scarce resource, etc. But yeah, I don't know that the argument is, well, look at these big things that money has been spent on, right? Obviously it works. It's like, well, obviously it was successful at creating CERN, but I don't know that that's a good counter argument that the free market wouldn't have done that because of the idea of profitability. I think what you're doing is you're overlaying assumptions about capitalism as a system, as opposed to what a world looks like where half of our resources aren't taken by the government.
Okay, well, I'm going to give you an example of something that I think is,
yeah, go ahead.
One of the biggest things that I think that we are missing, and because there's a big gap, I think, between the research scale, and like the pilot scale, and then the national scale, right? And that needs a ton of money. And this, the Inflation Reduction Act does put a lot of money towards things like algae biofuels, like for the first time that we can maybe go from the scale up stage. And that's the biggest problem, really, is because you know it works at the pilot stage. We know it works, but then we just don't have the money to go to that national stage. And I think like algae biofuels, basically, like the fuel that is in our car right now is basically hundreds of millions year old plants, and all the weight of the earth basically puts it into like kind of a slurry, which is like the crude oil that they extract from the ground, and then they purify out basically the fats or the lipids of the or the plant matter, and then that's what is our gas. The number and the octane actually refers to how many carbon chains there are in that lipid molecule. So
after learning about Teflon, that scares the shit out of me. You know what I mean? Like after I learned about Teflon poisoning, I was like, oh shit, man, that sucks.
It's pretty gnarly. But I mean, the thing is algae has the ability to actually create all of the gas and all those lipids that are needed in order for us to be 100% renewable, 100% self-sufficient, so we aren't reliant on foreign oil and imports and stuff like that. Yeah. And that's actually why the Department of Defense, who says the number one threat right now is climate change, they're putting so much money into algae biofuels, specifically because, for example, the Air Force and the Navy need complex aromatic rings in order to create jet fuel, and algae can actually do that. So and algae, I this is such an insane point that nobody makes it. And this is your thing's nuclear. This is my thing is like algae. If you're not, I don't understand why people don't talk about this, but it's like,
no, that's good. I'm glad.
I can make my 92 Ford Ranger a completely renewable car without having to go and make new batteries like, a Tesla or an electronic vehicle does. I can make that 1992 truck completely renewable by algae biofuels. And we can use all the existing infrastructure. We're talking about trillions of dollars of pipelines, of tanks, of gas stations. Nothing would change. Nothing would change about your life that if you have a combustion engine, you just go to the gas station and out comes algae biofuels, as opposed to, the carbon from the ground. And that's the big problem with emissions, by the way, is that we're basically taking carbon that's supposed to be in the ground and we're putting it into the air. Algae takes carbon from the air and puts it back into the air. So you do have emissions. You have a combustion engine and you have emissions, but the only cost of algae biofuels, the carbon footprint, if you will, is the cost of changing it from algae to that lipid. And that's actually, we're like researching it right now. We're trying to make it better, but that is the biggest problem. And it's actually removing the water from the slurry, because obviously water and oil don't work well together. So people are trying to get the water out of that. So the problem is I don't get why the market is there. Exxon is actually investing hundreds of millions of dollars into this, and the J. Craig Venter companies like Synthetic Genomics in San Diego, they see it. The gas companies see it, but instead of having to buy an all new car and establish an all new infrastructure for electric vehicles, contributing to the problem that you were talking about before with the vehicles, the rare earth minerals, the labor that's involved, we can take our existing infrastructure and just use a renewable source for it. And by the way, we could do it. We could.
Right. So I actually love that you brought up algae biofuels, right? Specifically, because I agree with you. I think that that is something that definitely needs research and development, and like it would solve a lot of fucking problems, especially just in cars. One of the biggest proponents of algae biofuel that put tens of millions of dollars in research into it was actually UPS, right? UPS was specifically, their former CEO was a big environmentalist and thought that he could actually, for profit, have a better, but was also valued that technology growth. And so he put tons and tons of money into research into algae biofuels, but eventually they had to scrap it because it was just too expensive for them to continue, because they didn't have like the ability to kind of like pull funds from elsewhere. And so, you know, I would say that, again, if the government hadn't stolen 40 to 52% of our wealth, right, we might already be in a world where algae biofuels are, are a normal thing because the government stopped stealing from us. And UPS would have had so much more funding to actually be able to continue their research in terms of at least jet fuel, so that planes could run on algae biofuel sustainably without some of the issues that they were coming with, because they really wanted to be the company that could more cheaply and effectively do next day air and like air flights of packages very quickly. And they thought that the key to doing that was algae biofuel, but they just didn't have the money to do it. And so, yeah, no, if the government got the fuck out of it and stopped spending their wasted money on, on their selectively edited programs, and just let the market handle things, yeah, we would have algae biofuels, and we would have to thank the for-profit corporation UPS for that.
I mean, it's interesting that the government subsidies of the oil companies make algae biofuels artificially more expensive, and that's one of the big problems. Is that oil companies don't create a product. They don't. They have a product that's already in the ground, and they refine their product, and then they sell it to us. Like, for example, for me, I work in algae biofuels. I'm biased, by the way, but I mean, I work on like the genetically modifying algae in order to make them better, not like in the engineering part. So I've been working.
Yeah, no, that's super fucking dope, though.
So but the point is that like thank you, that these oil companies are refining their product. They're not creating those carbon chains. Like for us in the algae biofuel space, we have to engineer algae that make those carbon rings and then figure out how to refine it. They're already, at the finished stage. I mean, like imagine Apple like having to just mine out the MacBook 15 or whatever. You know what I mean? Oh, we found a new MacBook, guys. It's like it doesn't exist, man. Like it's just so unfair. And then on top of that, giving tens of billions of dollars in tax breaks to the most profitable venture that's ever existed in the world. It's just
finally we have a massive place of agreement. I completely agree. The idea that the idea that like we recognize that humans are doing some form of damage. Now, I also think that we should get out of their way in terms of like some of the things way? like for example in Biden in the excessive taxation of new oh my god, what is it, new not refineries, drilling things. No, the where you drill oil. I can't think of the name of it. It doesn't matter. The leases, right? Like the Louisiana Supreme Court, state Supreme Court basically ruled that the new environmental taxes were so high that it literally priced them out of being able to even do so, and that they were like so cost prohibitive that they were like that it was illegal. And so he just suspended them in general, right? Like I think environmental activists and things like that getting in the way of fracking, getting in the way of oil companies and things like that is a problem. But I also think that those subsidies are rights violations as well. And I think we could easily balance these two things out, right? Like, you know what I mean? The net, if we got rid of all of these subsidies and also got rid of those massive taxations from like leases and things like that, I think you would probably see like a balancing effect to some degree. But I still think that the subsidies far outweigh the moratoriums on new leases and things like that. But ultimately, as a libertarian, I'm more concerned with the state interfering in the market based off of what it thinks is best, instead of letting people's values and the market and, you know, the natural supply and demand equation of the market and what people value being there. And I think the more effective and the more moral system, right, is to allow that to occur, but then to fight for people to value things that are better, right? To fight for things like more research in algae biofuels, or, you know, more research and development in thorium reactors, you know, things that are more sustainable and better for the environment, and will eventually have better outcomes for everyone, both in terms of profit and sustainability and everything. You know what I mean? Like, we also need more geothermal, right? Like, in places that can do it, like the cost is prohibitive for the production, right, of a site, right? But over time it saves money. It's like a lot of money, especially if we were actually to deregulate the oil and gas company to the point where they could get sued for the pollution that they do, right? Because that's another big thing, is that they do pollution and then they're immune from lawsuits in most cases from the direct pollution that they do to people. And it's like, well, yeah, the reason it's cost prohibitive is that they're allowed to aggress upon other people's clean air and allowed to poison their water. And then, like, so long as it's within EPA standards, like, this isn't a problem, right? I think once the market is opened up to that, like, most of these companies will be like, fuck, dude, like, this, we really have to clean up our factory, or our insurance is going to go through the roof and we're going to get sued all the time.
I mean, so if we agree that humans are causing a negative impact to the environment, and we did before, I mean, what if we valued that, and what do you think about, like, a cap and trade system in order to try to see it, like, things like, for example, like coal has been, by market forces, just kind of like pushed out by fracking, you know, and it's actually a huge win for you know, emissions are going down because of it. You know, what do you think about just like a cap and trade system in general?
Yeah, I think cap and trade is again, it's an immoral system, and it's ineffective, right? Like, we saw, you know, the early introduction of like cap and trade and the demand for lower carbon emissions in the UK, right, in the you know, beginning in the mid 90s, right? And what were the effects of those policies? The effect of those policies was increased carbon emissions. They just claimed they had less carbon emissions because they offshored their manufacturing to places like India and China that had horrible factories, right? That had no regulations and nobody gave a fuck, where the air is not breathable, and then using more gas and fuel to ship those things from halfway around the fucking world, right? And so when you actually look at the carbon footprint of the products per capita, what you saw was an increase in carbon emissions because of things like cap and trade and stuff like that. Really, all that is a means of offsetting manufacturing to other places for wealthy businesses and pricing out small businesses out of the market, and an increase in carbon emissions. And this is what happens when the government gets involved in these things, is they don't actually fix the fucking problems. They just sweep them under the rug and then claim victory. So, like, yeah, I don't think cap and trade is good. One, because it's an immoral system, right? That is not done in terms of natural law and people's individual liberty and businesses' ability to achieve. But also, I just don't think it's efficacious.
Do you think that like natural law pertains to people in the future?
I think natural law pertains to all people that are persons capable of inductive and deductive reasoning, which would
Current
include
people,
artificial general intelligence. Well, I think it's based philosophically upon axioms, right? And so, while it doesn't currently apply to people that don't exist yet, right? Because they don't exist, right? Those principles hold true forever. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess like I don't.
I hear the kiddos in the background.
Yeah. Mom's doing an awesome job. I don't agree with like a lot of the like alarmist like things where it's like we have to completely change society, because I think that's just like that's a non-starter for a lot of people. You know, I think that kind of just that kind of rhetoric is damaging, because
well, it's also not scientific, right? It's alarmism and
I mean, there's cause for it. It's worse
Yeah.
than you think it is. Let's be honest. Like,
I
a
mean,
lot of the people
I
in
don't
the
know
in the,
what
the renewable energy, like, space and stuff. It's like we're optimistic, like we are. Like you were saying, like there are people out there that do work that aren't for profits specifically, and I would argue scientists do that, since we all talk about how we could be making way more money, doing what, going into finance or whatever like that, or working for
Mhm.
one of the big tech companies or something like that. But we're purposely choosing to contribute solutions to problems that we see in the world. Um and I just think
Well,
that, like,
I would say that that's a value, right? I think the idea of
yeah.
profit isolated is really a bad way of looking at things, because like people will
Okay.
talk about like, look at how underpaid teachers are and look at how much money like coders make. This isn't fair. And it's like,
Yeah.
well, people don't go into coding because like, I mean, some people do, they're called autists, but like for the most part, people don't go into coding because they're just like massively like, passionate about the code, right? Most people aren't like looking at the matrix, like, oh, the numbers are beautiful, right? They go into it because they can make fucking money, right? People go into teaching because they want to be a part of shaping a new generation, because they want to feel fulfilled. They want to feel like they're a part of something good. And I think that that's probably true of a lot of scientists like yourself, right? Part of the pay is that you're working on something that is a part of the future, right? You're working on something that leads to a better world for your children. And you get to come home and you get to look at those babies in the eyes and know that like what you did today was designed to make a better world for them. And that's a hard thing to put a price tag on, right? And so I think this idea of like focusing on for profit and things like that, I think is really comes from a mindset of like looking at the system of capitalism as like an economic model and like trying to isolate it from the humans that live in it, and then like and unfairly malign the things that you don't like about that system, and then otherize things that are a part of those things.
Yeah, and I agree, and I think that one of the problems with focusing specifically on emissions is that it's kind of like one of those things where you can't. We're sounding the alarm, but people can't do anything about it individually,
Today.
right?
Yeah.
Where it's like you could buy a Tesla, but then you live in Missouri and they're
It's like
chugging
80% coal. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So it's
Did
like
you see that video? Did you see that video? There's like a video
No.
going around where like they were showing like some small towns like first like Tesla plug-in, and like like the mayor was there and everything. And then like a journalist was like, how much of your energy is coal? And like the first lady was like, oh, I don't know. Like the mayor or like the person that was in charge of it was like, oh, I don't know. And then they talked to a different government official that actually like does this. And then he's like about 80 to 90% coal. And it was just like,
Yeah,
oh fuck,
gross.
you're not doing
That's very
anything.
gross. Yeah, I mean, imagine that person thinking that they're doing a good thing, and then they're watching the CO2 ppms, and it just keeps going up, and you're like, "What's going on?" And you're like, "Well, by the way,
Or like in California, they're facing brownouts and blackouts potentially, and then they're like also mandating that everyone has an electric car by 2030.
Yeah, I think that is a
Dog,
problem. I
like your
agree with
energy
you.
grid is weak. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like,
Yeah, I agree with you. But I think like the discussion should be about like the discussion on how we should, if humans are negatively impacting the environment, which I agree, and that's kind of like how I would talk to people, kind of like as a scientist about this. And I wish that this discussion was at this level about
Mhm.
how we can actually individually impact it. And it's more of like, the individual's power is more on the line of like zoning, for example, like for, zoning meetings and commissions and boards at your city hall, like have a big impact on like natural places not being segmented, because there's the biggest problem that we're having right now, like
I
in the
disagree.
environment, is that stuff is dying.
I
Stuff is
disagree.
dying. We're like,
I think the biggest impact that you can do is that you can take the time to research the companies and the products that you buy, right? And if you're buying products from Nestle, you're fucking up, right? Like you know what I'm
okay.
saying? Like if you're buying products from companies that are a part of the problem in that regard, then and you're choosing to. So for example, there was a wonderful company. They got bought out by Lay's, so I no longer support them. But when they weren't, and many of you may know this company and may not know that they were bought out by Lay's. But this company was, they made potato chips. What is the Kettle? Was it Kettle brand?
Oh.
Yeah, Kettle chips. So before they were bought out by Lay's, what they did is they used all of the potato skins and they turned the potato skins into like alcohol-based fuel that they used in their own factory. They gave to local charities. They gave like a percentage of all of their profits to reforestation and nature conservation in their local community at their factories. They were incredible. Like their bags had like these like weird, like kind of like sun chips. They were these thick, like crinkly, loud bags. And it's because they were like done in a much more environmentally sustainable way with a lot of like plant material in them. They were a great company and their chips were delicious. And then Lay's bought them and then they stopped being a great company in that way. You know what I mean? But I mean, like, but if you knew that at the time, right? Mm-hmm. It'd been a great company to support and buy from. I think you have more. I think people have more purchasing power in terms of changing things than they realize.
I don't disagree with you on that. I think that, you know, and especially but again, this is like more of an emissions look on things, on how they're looking at it, and that's the problem that I think that we're in, and that's why this problem seems so insurmountable. Is that because we've created this behemoth that we can't just solve? Like, you know, like for example, like 70% of animal populations, just the numbers of animals that are out there, are down by 70% in the last 50 years. You know, it's you know, like 90% of the wetlands that have gone extinct within the last 50 years. And that doesn't have to deal the vast majority of that does not have to deal with CO2 ppms. This has to do with like human activity, right? This is people wanting to live at the coast, wanting to live near rivers. These are, you know, wetland ecosystems that are going.
Well, it's also it's a importation of invasive plant species is another big part of that, right? Like there's the interconnectivity of humans and bringing in like Japanese Cuzco to like America, and now like Japanese Cuzco is fucking everywhere, and it like ruins certain trees, right? It just fucks up a whole forest.
Exactly. Yeah, invasive species are a huge problem.
Oh, Cuzco, not kudzu. Sorry.
Even California mustard, which is, I live in California. You can see these, you know, 4 foot.
Of course, you fucking live
mustard.
in California. You lefty fucking scientist, fucking weirdo. Of course, you live in Cali.
University of California, man. We're just slaying it.
I went to Liberty for my grad school. I went to a Christian university as an atheist. Beautiful. It was
fun. My point is that like even the California mustard, the one that's named after California, is an invasive species. It's pretty nuts. But I guess like the bigger problem is that we are impacting the environment negatively in so many different ways that, you know, emissions and CO2 ppm is kind of like a large problem that can only be really solved at the national and international level, in my opinion, where it's kind of like you can have like a national government that would be regulating and incentivizing renewable fuels, that kind of like energy production, as opposed to at the local level where you can make a big impact at like, you know, zoning commissions, creating connected nature, and that would, you know, cleaning up your local parks, you know, that kind of stuff. I mean, you do have like a huge impact on that. And you know, if people everywhere kind of like got more connected with nature, then people would care more about these places and the animal populations would come back. And because we know, you know, environmental health is going down basically, and that's not good. But we know in ecology, 2 things that make a really healthy environment. 1, it's lots of animals that live there, and then 2, lots of species, a lot of different species
biodiversity
that live there. Exactly, biodiversity in numbers,
which is a big problem.
Exactly.
Right. So I will say 2 things. Number 1, we're comparing it to an imaginary system, right? Which is, what would we have if we didn't have half of our wealth taken, right? So again, the idea, the impetus is we have a problem, therefore we need to steal from people to fund the solution to this problem. involves a morally unjustifiable thing, which is the theft from people. So I'll never support that, right? The second is one needs perfect knowledge in order to gauge consequentialism from a normative ethical framework, right? Because you need to know the future impact of all of the decisions that you make, as well as, the current impact, and you need to know all of them. And even then you're still going to have a subjective bias in terms of what you value, right? In terms of like, if your value is, let's say, human flourishment, right? Like, these are things that are they're difficult, nigh impossible to measure. So yeah, I'll never support those things just because they involve immoral, unjustifiable things. I have no problem with supporting voluntary means of doing and solving these problems. And I think you can see from our conversation that I do view that. The other thing I need to say is that one of the cool things about having an active chat is when you say something wrong, they immediately shit on you for it. So it was not bought by Lay's. It was bought by Snyder's. Okay. Snyder's Lance, which makes Campbell's soup. Okay. Different company. Still, if you check their website, all the fucking cool shit that they used to do, they no longer brag about because they're not doing that shit anymore. But I said the wrong company. All right. I'll take that fucking L. If that's the worst thing I've said tonight, I'm okay with it.
I guess my biggest fear is that we are in a tragedy of the commons scenario where we don't see the importance of the, environmental health being so important to human health in the future. We see our humans in the environment being completely abstracted from one another, and then them just dying off where we can't recover it. And there are technological solutions that are out there for maybe seeding the oceans with iron, for example. So then you could actually bring down more CO2 and then maybe burying that, algae bloom or something like that, and burying some of that CO2. But, if an entire ecosystem goes extinct, we have no idea how to bring that back. We haven't done the sequencing to know the diversity that's out there. There's millions of species out there that we don't even know about. 99.9% of microbes that are out there have never been used in the lab, cultured in the lab or sequenced. So, and if we lose the microbes in the ocean, for example, that's where 60 to 70% of our oxygen comes from. I mean, they're called ecosystem services, where they have complete, it's basically everything that you can see, that you can touch right now, or if you look around you, is somehow tied to the ecosystem and the environment in some way.
No, I agree. But I think the biggest problem and the biggest reason we have this tragedy of the commons is high time preference, right? I think that what the state has done by creating social welfare systems for people and stealing so many of their resources is that we have a very large percentage of the poor and lower middle class in our countries that have an incredibly high marginal propensity to consume, right? Values of 1 and over 1. And so what has occurred is a psychological kind of religious statism that the government will fix these problems, take more of my money. And so what ends up happening is we trust a corrupt institution run by people that are bought off by corporations, instead of having a society of people that have a low time preference, that think more about the future, think about investment, think about what am I going to do with grandma in 10 years, right? All of these things that we give the government to do. And I think it has created an infantile, sheepish society of people that give it over to an organization that is ill-equipped to be able to do this at all. And so believe it or not, many people see a libertarian or a conservative economically and they go, oh, this guy, he's clearly not going to be about this environmentalism shit. I actually am really passionate about environmentalism. I just think that the proposed solutions are those that benefit large corporations and Malthusian communists that want large state power to violate our rights instead of actually solving these fucking problems. And I don't agree that stealing tons of resources for government funding of programs to presumably fix these problems is the way to go about it. I think we need to free up these resources, and we need to have conversations like this where You argue for algae biofuels. I argue for nuclear, right? We inform people about some of the issues with the oil industry and some of the solar and wind issues. And we like kind of figure out what these solutions are, and we free up the economy for innovation. And you know what I mean? Like, imagine a world where so much of this money wasn't taken. Like what individuals could have possibly achieved, right? Like, for example, one of the things that we know isn't effective currently because of our technology are those machines that, carbon capture from the atmosphere. But like, that might have been that's something that can turn a profit, right? Because you can turn carbon capture into fertilizer. And so if we didn't have such massive regulation and taxation, and we had the ability to innovate in certain ways, we might be able to create, we might be in a world, like, it's fiction, who fucking knows, right? But we might already be in a world where carbon capture machines are highly profitable, and we don't have to fucking worry about emissions because we have fucking giant, really effective machines that pull out massive carbon out of the atmosphere, turn it into fertilizer, which would also solve some of our nitrogen, our newer nitrogen fertilizer issues in, let's say, the Netherlands and Canada, and we wouldn't have the EU cracking down on them, which is going to starve hundreds of millions of people in the name of environmentalism.
Interesting. I haven't heard about that. I mean, I know that there's a huge runoff problem with nitrogen that happens.
They're demanding that places cut their nitrogen emissions by 40 to 90%, depending on where they are, and it's basically going to destroy what is the second largest producer of farming. The amount of agriculture that gets produced, if it goes through in the name of environmentalism, it's going to massively reduce the amount of vegetables and bread that is and wheat that is in the world. You combine that with what's going on in the Ukraine, which is another bread basket, and you're looking at mass starvation in a year or two if all those policies go through.
Interesting. I hadn't heard about this. This is interesting.
Look up the Dutch farmers protests.
We're actually working on this exact thing. I actually wrote one of my reviews I wrote for Nature Nanotechnology had to deal with delivering micronutrients to plants in order to stop this from kind of happening. Basically, the runoff, the larger ecological problem here is that.
So hold on, you're saying if you can increase the delivery rate, more is absorbed and you have less runoff?
Yeah, basically microdosing them as they need it. So and also delivering through nanotechnology the nitrogen and the micronutrients exactly where they need it in the plant, so that you don't have all this nitrogen going into the soil, going into the water, which leads to oxygen minimal zones in the oceans that kill off fish pools. That's like when you see 3,000 fish died on a beach, and you're like, why would it kill that many fish? It's it's a school of fish that they ran out of oxygen and they all died. It had to do with nitrogen runoff. So
that's awesome. That's cool. I don't know. That's interesting. I'm not a big science person, but then you know what I mean? So I think people like you often get desensitized to just how cool some shit is. You know what I mean? And then you hear it and you're not in that field and you're like, that's fucking awesome, man. I wish you success in that, even if you're doing it with stolen government money.
Yeah, dude. So
even more so do I wish success, I just,
there's, I mean, it's with the little, it's actually really cool. There's a quantum dot or a carbon dot. It's literally just a dot of carbon and stuff, like a ball. And we're talking about 1 to 3 nanometers here. They're super, super small. And then we connect it to a little basket. And then in that basket, we can put in whatever we want. So we could put in the micronutrient or something, and then target that little nanoparticle with the basket to wherever we want in the cell. So that's kind of what my lab is. Well, the lab that I'm in is working on. I'm not the.
That's pretty cool. I'm not gonna lie.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I don't know how that'll work, but hopefully it works. Hey, look, we've been talking for about 2 hours.
Yeah. Thank you, man. I appreciate it.
So what I'm going to do first is, okay, you already have the content creator role. So because you have the content creator role, there's a channel called self-promotion in the Discord. So if you have a cool video that goes live or something, just throw it up in that channel. And that channel is only for people that are YouTubers, Twitch streamers, TikTokers, etc. Maybe throw you a couple views, I don't know.
Cool. Yeah. I appreciate it. Well, thanks, man. If you ever want to talk about science or something comes up, or or whatever.
Also, DM me so that I remember, and I'll like do it later, and I'll link you up with Corey Campbell.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, that'd be really cool. I'd really appreciate that. I will. Yeah.
What? Sorry, I just checked Discord, and it's just like random memes. Just like, yo.
Bunch of algae stuff,
fuck.
probably.
No, it's fine. But
One day.
yes. It was nice meeting you. Shout yourself out.
Yeah.
I got to get on with looking at this Dave Smith stick, sex, and hammer debate. Like, I cannot push that off another night. I already pushed it off one night when I said I was going to do it.
Yeah, my name's Greg. I have a YouTube channel called The Peer Review. You can go there by going to thepeer.review, and I talk about the cool shit in science that nobody else is talking about, and check out my debate with Haas on DNA.
There you go.
Well, I hope to
have a
talk
good
to you
night.
soon, man. Yeah, have a good one, man.
Yeah, of
Appreciate
course.
it. Bye.
You just watched a clip from our Twitch channel, Fabian Liberty. If you like content like this, please like and subscribe here on YouTube, or go ahead and give us a follow on twitch.tv/Fabian Liberty.